Today, we dive into the extraordinary journey of two icons who turned their pain into power, their silence into strength. Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman. Keith Urban, the boy from the windswept coasts of New Zealand who once clutched a guitar like a shield against fear, was never meant to fade among Nashville's crowded halls. With fire forged in wounds and a voice trembling with raw truth, he did not just play country music. He reshaped it. Every riff of his guitar struck like lightning across the American heartland. Every lyric carried the weight of survival until Grammy Awards, platinum records, and sold-out stadiums bowed to a man who turned his scars into symphonies. Nicole Kidman, born beneath Pacific skies and raised with Australian resolve, was not destined to be a footnote. She was born to redefine cinema. From a girl silenced by a stutter to a woman who vanished into characters with terrifying depth, she bled for every role until the Academy itself surrendered an Oscar into her hands. She did not act. She transfigured, carrying audiences into worlds so fragile and fierce that silence followed her like reverence in a cathedral. When their worlds collided, it was not merely a marriage. It was an alchemy of music and cinema, two broken spirits daring to fuse into something larger than myth, a love story the world hailed as indestructible. Yet behind the ovations, shadows gathered. Relapses, silences, and griefs unseen by cameras clawed at their sanctuary, testing a union once believed eternal. And now at 57, Keith Urban has finally spoken, admitting the truth about his marriage. After nearly 19 years together, the fairy tale has ended not in scandal, but in silence, dignity, and the cruel ache of farewell. Before we begin, if their journey has ever moved you, leave a like as a tribute to two lives that carried us through storms most of us could scarcely endure. Before the love story, before the marriage that once dazzled Hollywood as unshakable, before the Grammys and the thunder of fame, there was only a boy, barefoot, breathless, and already drowning in storms no child should endure. Keith Lionel Urban entered the world on October 26, 1967, in Whangarei, New Zealand. But destiny offered him no stillness. At just 2, his family uprooted to Kabul, Queensland, chasing a better life that never arrived. And what followed was not shelter, but fire, relentless and merciless. At 9, Keith stood in the street as his childhood home was devoured by flames that crawled up the walls like living beasts. Photographs curled into smoke, toys melted into liquid shadows, and every dream he had turned to ash in a single night. The stench of burning timber clung to the air. The crack of collapsing beams echoed like gunfire, and a boy stood frozen, clutching nothing but fear. Neighbors rushed forward with boxes of second-hand clothes, strangers whispering mercy into the chaos. Years later, Keith would remember in a trembling voice, "All we had left was each other, and the kindness of strangers who reminded me that not all things burn." But the inferno outside was only a reflection of the darker blaze within his own home. His father, Robert Bob Urban, was a man of violent extremes, a passionate lover of country music, yet an unpredictable alcoholic whose silence and fury smothered the house like smoke. The same man who first placed a guitar in Keith's hands also placed terror in his heart. Affection was absent, tenderness a stranger, and the words every child longs to hear never came. "I don't remember him ever saying he loved me," Keith confessed years later, each syllable shaking like a confession of a wound still open. That absence was not sorrow. It was devastation. Nights at home were suffocating, where the slam of a door cracked like thunder and silence weighed heavier than fists. And yet, in the rubble of that chaos, a fragile gesture flickered. Bob taped a handwritten sign to the window of his shop. "Guitar teacher wanted for my son." That sign became salvation. It led young Keith to Sue McCarthy, the teacher who became his first safe harbor, the first soul to believe in him. At 4, he strummed a ukulele. At 6, he held a guitar, not like a toy, but like armor strapped to a fragile body. And in a house ruled by volatility, the guitar was never merely an instrument. It was a shield, a voice, a lifeline clutched by a boy desperate to survive. Through adolescence, Keith bled into strings and chords with a desperation the world mistook for discipline. At Tamworth festivals, standing beside Jenny Wilson, he collected accolades like the Golden Guitar, dazzling audiences who saw only brilliance, never the fracture beneath. But behind every ovation stood a boy still gasping for air, still fleeing the silence of home. Nights stretched in smoky pubs, his parents flinging him from one gig to another, while he played stages far too large for a heart still so broken. The applause roared like waves, but it never filled the cavern inside. Later, in a voice heavy with both gratitude and grief, Keith confessed, "Music saved me. It gave me somewhere to go when home didn't feel like home." Those words were not performance. They were a revelation carved out of agony. His childhood was not merely hard. It was devastating, lonely, unjust. And yet, from fire and fists, from forgotten hugs and bruises invisible to the eye, Keith Urban was not shattered. He was forged. He turned silence into sound, wounds into rhythm, pain into poetry. And this is where his story truly begins. Not in the glitter of red carpets, not in the embrace of a Hollywood star, but in the ashes of a boyhood burned too soon. A boy who never heard the words he longed for, yet grew into a man who made the world listen. Every song, every stage, every love he would one day cling to, including the woman who seemed sent to heal him, carried the echo of that barefoot child staring into the flames, discovering that even from ruin, music could be reborn as salvation. If Keith's childhood was forged in fire and fear, Nicole's began in silence. The kind of silence that convinces a child she does not belong and maybe never will. She entered the world on June 20th, 1967, in the heavy humidity of Honolulu, Hawaii, while her father, Anthony Kidman, chased a PhD in psychology, and her mother, Janelle Glennie, pursued nursing with quiet determination. Though born on American soil, her heartbeat would grow on Australian ground, where two cultures braided together inside her, often leaving her with eyes wide in awe, but also with a gnawing sense of alienation. At just 3 years old, the Kidman family returned to Sydney, where Nicole and her younger sister, Antonia, were raised in a home that from the outside looked like a sanctuary of intellect and compassion. At the dinner table, conversations overflowed with psychology, philosophy, and care.
Her father soon a respected academic, her mother an educator and editor. But amid this nurturing world, Nicole carried a storm with no name, only silence. She was painfully shy, her voice strangled by a stutter that choked her words before they could escape. I remember being terrified of speaking up as if my voice didn't belong to me, she would confess years later, recalling the hollow loneliness of those years. A child surrounded by brilliance, yet locked inside an invisible cage where no one could hear her cries. And yet, even in that silence, a doorway cracked open. At just 3, Nicole discovered ballet. Music and movement flowing through her small body like a secret language of freedom. On the stage, she was no longer the trembling child with downcast eyes, but a spirit unchained. In that sacred space, she was finally seen without speaking, heard without sound. But the world outside the stage was merciless. Her lanky frame, fiery curls, and porcelain skin made her stand out like a flame in a dark room. A flame others tried to snuff out with cruel laughter. Whispers followed her in school hallways. Mocking glances cut deeper than knives, until the sense of being the other became her shadow. Yet Nicole refused to collapse beneath it. She transmuted alienation into strength. Out of isolation, empathy bloomed. Out of mockery, resilience hardened. Her parents, attuned to her fragility, but also her brilliance guided her into the Australian theater for young people. The crucible that would transform her life. Among dusty scripts and harsh stage lights, she met Naomi Watts, a bond that would last a lifetime. But even more importantly, Nicole found a first true echo of her own voice. "It was the first time I felt I belonged somewhere," she recalled, her words trembling with both relief and memory, as if a door that had been locked her entire life had finally opened. From there, she dared leaps most teenagers would never imagine. At 14, she appeared in Bush Christmas 1983, her screen presence already luminous, her silence now translated into power. At 16, Nicole Kidman made an audacious choice to abandon the safety of traditional schooling and surrender completely to acting. A leap that might have terrified others, but for Nicole, it was survival. Her parents, seeing the fragile light within her, offered unwavering support. They had recognized her potential long before the world did. But those early years were far from glamorous. They were filled with invisibility, hiding within borrowed characters because her own skin still felt unsafe. Nicole later admitted, "I often felt invisible. It was easier to disappear into someone else." Her quietness, often mistaken for fragility, was her most profound gift. The ability to feel without armor, to bleed emotion without filters, to carry empathy as a second skin. Every trembling glance, every whisper of pain was born from these hidden years, from silence, ridicule, and the art of survival. Nicole's journey proves that sometimes the quietest children grow into the loudest truths. Nicole's childhood did not crush her. It sharpened her into a blade of empathy. She learned that silence could become power, wounds could turn into a voice, and the stage could become a sanctuary for those once unseen. She transformed ridicule into resilience, her silence into strength. And through this unsteady strength, she carved her path, not merely to be seen, but to be heard. What followed wasn't chance, but fire. Nicole's fearless roles blurred the line between acting and truth, awakening in audiences the unspoken ache they carried in silence. From a child silenced by a stutter to an icon whose voice would one day shake the world, Nicole Kidman's journey is proof that even in the deepest silence, destiny is already writing its loudest song. While Nicole carried a silence that once convinced her she didn't belong, Keith Urban carried wounds that burned like fire, scars from fists, flames, and forgotten love that nearly consumed him. Music wasn't just his gift, it was his trial. Born in Caboolture, Keith's climb from child prodigy to country music icon was never easy. It was brutal, shaped not by privilege, but by rejection and resilience. At 8, Keith stood on rickety stages in smoke-filled pubs, playing for people who barely noticed. His parents, still carrying the ashes of their lost home, became reluctant tour managers, driving him from one backroad gig to another. For Keith, every chord wasn't performance, but prayer. By 15, his gift was undeniable, but his world remained small. Despite his undeniable talent, labels rejected him. Too rock for country, too country for rock. Yet, he didn't give up. "I just wanted to play," he recalled. "I needed music more than I needed air." In 1990, Keith released his debut album, but it didn't make waves. In 1992, he took a desperate leap, leaving behind his home, family, and every shred of security for Nashville. A decision less about ambition than defiance, an act of silent war against every voice that told him he wasn't enough. Nashville slammed doors in his face, but Keith's refusal to give up only strengthened him. He lived through rejection, failure, and loneliness, but he couldn't stop because music was oxygen. Finally, in 1999, his self-titled debut album became a spark in the dark. But for the grace of God, shot to #1, and with it came his resurrection. Keith's rise wasn't instant, but it was built on survival, proving that scars could be turned into symphonies. Fame didn't heal the wounds, it magnified them. But Keith's success was undeniable. His albums went triple platinum, and awards flooded in. Yet, despite all the accolades, Keith often admitted to feeling more alone than ever. The applause, he confessed, sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. The deeper the success, the darker the shadows from his past seemed to grow. At the same time, Nicole Kidman's career soared. She fought against Hollywood's labels, not pleading to be seen, but demanding it. From Days of Thunder to To Die For, she carved out roles that were as raw as they were unforgettable. She was no longer just acting. She was shaping stories from her own pain. The Golden Globe she won for To Die For wasn't applause, but a declaration of war, a declaration that she was here to reign on her own terms. As Nicole's career rose, so did her personal struggles. She endured private heartbreaks, including multiple miscarriages and a devastating divorce from Tom Cruise. In 2001, Tom filed for divorce without warning, leaving Nicole devastated. She had fought for their children, but Isabella and Connor chose to live with their father. Alone in the echo of her empty home, Nicole found herself questioning what went wrong. She admitted, "I felt like I didn't exist in that relationship anymore." But Nicole didn't collapse. She poured her grief into her craft, and in The Hours, 2002, she won an Oscar for her role as Virginia Woolf. This wasn't just a win, it was resurrection. Nicole Kidman had turned her darkest moments into the brightest triumphs of her career. She was no longer just a star, she was a survivor. By 2005, both Nicole and Keith had walked through their private ruins. Keith, scarred by addiction and loneliness, found himself on stages roaring before thousands, but still felt utterly unseen. Nicole, hollowed by divorce, hid her grief behind a veneer of red carpets. Yet when they met that January at a Hollywood gala, something unspoken passed between them. Not lightning, not spectacle, but a quiet recognition. They both saw survivors in each other. They connected in silence, far from the headlines. A year later, they married in a candlelit church in Sydney. To the world, it was a fairy tale. But for Keith, it was salvation. His vows were tested immediately when, just 4 months after their wedding, he relapsed. Nicole didn't walk away. She chose to fight with him, not against him. With her support, Keith entered rehab, and they emerged from the darkness stronger. Their love wasn't flawless, but it was fought for. Nicole and Keith built a family, balancing their blazing careers with the fragility of everyday life. They weathered fires, both literal and emotional, standing by each other through grief and addiction. Yet, after 19 years, cracks began to show. In 2024, Keith moved out of their Nashville home, and by September 2025, Nicole filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. No scandal, no betrayal, just the slow suffocation of a love that had run out of breath. Their story ended not in headlines, but in silence. Despite the pain, what remains is a legacy of survival. Keith and Nicole's love story proved that even in breaking, love can still burn bright enough to light the world.